afternoon. As people are joining this webinar, thank you very much for being here. I want to take a brief moment to go over the sort of run of show and the rules for this webinar. So if you're familiar with CGS webinars, this will seem familiar. First, if you have any questions, please do submit them using the Q&A feature. Because of the complexity of this topic and the need for potentially a little bit more looking back at the regulations, be really precise in our answers, we have disabled the chat for this, just to make sure that the information that is getting shared is the most accurate that we can. But please do use the Q&A function to submit any questions you may have for the panelists. This webinar is being recorded. The recording and our presenters' slides will be emailed to all attendees following the event. And they'll also be made available on the CGS website and CGS YouTube channel. And at this time, I'm going to turn it over to CGS President Suzanne Ortega to introduce the webinar.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Good afternoon or good morning, colleagues, depending on where you are. Welcome to this important webinar on the Biden administration, gainful employment and financial transparency regulations. As Sarah said, I'm Suzanne Ortega, the president of the Council of Graduate Schools, and I'm really delighted to have you all join us today for what promises to be an important, informative, and timely discussion of these regulations. I expect most of you know that on October 10th, 2023, the U.S. Department of Education released the final regulations on gainful employment and financial value transparency. These regulations will go into effect on July 1st, which will be here before you know it, 2024. And institutions of higher education will be required to report institutional student data to the department beginning on July 31st, 2024. So for today's webinar, we will have an in-depth discussion on the gainful employment and financial value transparency regulations, hoping to gain a little fuller understanding on important provisions such as accountability, reporting, and disclosure requirements. Before introducing our esteemed panelists, I would like to commend to your attention the really nicely done, thank you, Amy and Eric, CGS webpage on gainful employment and financial value transparency. I think Sarah will include the link at some point, so you'll have that, you can pull it up. But the webpage includes the final regulations, a CGS summary of the regulations, and other important resources. Following the webinar, this webinar also will be available on the CGS Gainful Employment and Financial Value Transparency webpage. So without further ado, I want to introduce our panelists so we can get to the work of important conversation. And we're going to start today's webinar hearing from our colleagues at the U.S. Department of Education. Antoinette Flores is a Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy Planning and Innovation at the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Postsecondary Education. And David Musser is the Deputy Director of Policy Implementation and Oversight at the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Federal Student Aid. Together, Antoinette and David will give us an overview of the regulation and, if available, and they'll tell us if it is, provide us a little more information about the implementation of the regulations. After hearing from our colleagues at the Department of Education, we'll hear from Karen McCarthy, who is the Vice President of Public Policy and Federal Relations at the National Association of Student Financial Aid Administrators. And she'll share with us the perspective of her organization and how financial aid administrators are working with other campus constituents, such as admissions offices, business officers, institutional research officers, and others, to really ensure compliance with the regulations. After we hear from Karen, we're going to hear from three of our fellow CGS deans, Dr. William Graves, the Graduate School Dean at Iowa State University, Dr. Mary Stromberger, the Vice Provost for Graduate Education and Dean of the Graduate School at the Ohio State University, and Dr. Dana Williams, the Graduate School Dean at Howard University. We truly have a distinguished panel, and I'm confident that today's discussion will provide valuable information about these regulations, and what actions institutions of higher education hopefully are already taking and will continue to take to be ready to report institutional data on July 31st. Once again, thanks so much for joining to us. And now we can take a deep dive into our discussion. And with that, I'll turn it over to Antoinette and David for their presentation.
Hi, good afternoon. Thanks so much for having us. To give you a sense of what we'll cover in the short amount of time we have available, I suspect that you all are quite familiar with our gainful employment and financial value transparency regulations, or as we refer to them, GE and FVT. But if you're not, we will provide a broad overview, including the terms that we use and how they apply. David will go through some of the specifics on the reporting requirements and our plans for implementation and what you can expect from the department over the coming months. Next slide. And next slide. Thanks. One of the primary concerns that we were hoping to address in issuing these regulations is unaffordable student debt relative to student earnings. From what we know, when we look at the data, unaffordable debt is most concentrated in career training programs. Approximately 700,000 students annually incur debts that are too high compared to their earnings, or enroll in programs that result in earnings lower than a high school graduate. While career training programs account for just 15% of overall enrollment, it accounts for 45% of student loan borrowers with unaffordable debt. But that was not our only goal. We are also concerned about unaffordable debt and low earnings more broadly outside of career training education programs. For many non-gainful employment programs, particularly at the certificate and graduate level, these programs produce high debt relative to income. Next slide. So I'm going to cover some of the main terms and definitions that we use within the regulations, what we mean, and how they apply. We use the terms both gainful employment programs and eligible non-gainful employment or non-GE programs. Gainful employment programs include virtually all for-profit programs at for-profit colleges and all non-degree programs at nonprofit and public institutions that lead to a recognized credential. Eligible non-GE programs include programs other than GE programs that lead to a recognized credential, including associate's, bachelor's, and master's degree programs. In both circumstances, the regulations do not apply to comprehensive transition and post-secondary programs or to prison education programs. Next slide. Which regulations apply to which institution types? Financial value transparency regulations, the primary goal with this portion of the regulations is transparency. They apply to both GE and non-GE programs, assess the financial value using debt to earnings rates and an earnings premium measure. And under financial value transparency, institutions must post consumer information and in some cases obtain student acknowledgements of the information posted on a department website. Under gainful employment regulations, programs are subject to accountability measures that may have an impact on Title IV eligibility. These regulations apply only to GE programs. Like financial value transparency, they're subject to debt to earnings rates and an earnings premium measure. Thanks, David. If you could go back one slide. Thanks. And For these programs, if a program fails at least one of the measures in 2 of 3 consecutive years, it loses Title IV eligibility and is prevented from adding similar programs for Title IV eligibility in the future. Like financial value transparency, it includes student acknowledgements, but it also requires student warnings in the event of failure. Next slide. So the 2 measures that we use within these regulations are the debt to earnings and earnings premium measures, which apply both to GE and non-GE programs. The debt to earnings measure measures the debt burden faced by a typical graduate of a program by comparing the share of income needed to make loan payments against median annual earnings. It includes both an annual and discretionary debt measure, and debt used in the calculation is capped at institutional charges minus institutional scholarships provided. The earnings premium measures a program's earning outcomes by comparing completers' median annual earnings for working adults age 25 to 34 with only a high school diploma in the state where the institution is located, or nationally if less than 50% of students are from another state. Next slide. When do the various requirements apply? Depending on the regulation, it could include an acknowledgement or a warning. An acknowledgement requirement applies if a GE or non-GE program fails the debt to earning metric. It does not cover the earnings premium. And the program is not an undergraduate degree program, so an associate's or bachelor's degree, but it would apply to certificate or master's degree programs. Under the acknowledgements, the department administers the acknowledgement process, and prospective students must acknowledge that they viewed the information on the department's website before an institution enters an enrollment agreement with the student. Warnings, on the other hand, only apply to GE programs, and they apply if a program fails either the debt to earnings or earnings premium measure. Unlike the acknowledgements, warnings are provided by the institution, not the department. And for students that are currently enrolled, they must be informed within 30 days of failure. Prospective students must be informed before they enroll or receive aid, and the institution must wait at least 3 days before enrolling a student after they have seen the warning. Next slide. I'm going to turn it to David. Thanks, David.
All right, thanks, Antoinette. So let's talk a little bit about how we determine the students that will be included in the metrics, as well as what the schools will be actually reporting when they complete the financial value transparency and gainful employment reporting. So first, let's talk through what we mean when we say cohort periods. So the department calculates both debt to earnings rates and the earnings premium measure using the debt and the earnings of students who complete a program during a specific cohort period. The cohort period is either 2 or 4 years. So we use the 2-year cohort period is actually the default period. And we use that if 30 or more students completed the program during that 2-year period. If they didn't, if you had fewer than 30 students complete during that period, then the department shifts to a 4-year cohort period that will look at all the students who graduated during that 4-year cohort period to determine the metrics. And if fewer than 30 students graduated during that whole 4-year cohort period, then we will not calculate either debt to earnings rates or the earnings premium measure for that program in that year. So this is actually done every single year. So you could have some programs that have a number of students right on that border that could go in and out of having calculations. But generally speaking, programs will probably fall into one of these 3 categories and will stay in that category. So for the 2-year cohort, we're using students who completed the program during the 3rd and 4th award years prior to the year of the most recent earnings data. And the 4-year cohort includes students who completed the program during the 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th award years prior to the most recent earnings data, the year of the most recent earnings data. Go on to the next slide. So just to show you in real terms what we mean for the 24-25 award year, where we're obtaining data, the 2-year cohort period is the 17-18 and 18-19 award years, and the 4-year cohort period includes the award years from 15-16 through 18-19. There is an exception to this. There is a longer period that we use for programs that are considered qualifying graduate programs. There's a specific definition in the regulations for these. They include programs that are in occupational clusters that involve a lot of post-graduation work requirements. And you can think of, easily think of things like medicine and other programs where people sort of automatically assume that there are these stringent post-graduation work requirements during which the student is likely not earning very much. So for these programs, we've essentially extended the period between the graduation date of the students and when we look at their earnings in order to account for this period when they are in post-graduation work that is generally low paying or not paying at all. So the department identified specific occupations for the upcoming award year and the next 2 years. These include medicine, osteopathy, dentistry, clinical psychology, marriage and family counseling, clinical social work, and clinical counseling. These were identified in response to comments from the public, as well as the department's own research into various fields that have these sorts of requirements. But we acknowledged in the rule that there could be other professions that have these sorts of requirements, or that requirements could change over time. So the department will update that general list of programs every 3 years and give the community an opportunity to give comments on the additional programs at that time. Let's go on to the next slide. So what is a program? A program for gainful employment and financial value transparency purposes is a combination of the 6-digit classification of instructional program code and the credential level for the program. Now, schools are always providing both of those things when they submit enrollment information for students in the National Student Loan Data System. That's how the department identifies a program for financial value transparency and gainful employment purposes. Now, some of you may already be thinking, that's not exactly the same as how I define programs, and that's exactly right. There may be cases where the specific programs that you offer at your school that have specific names and that have maybe even specific concentrations are not separated in for the purposes of these metrics, and that's by design. This is intended to identify at this level of specificity all the students who are in this set of programs that fall into these two categories: 6-digit zip code and credential level. And again, the credential level is the degree level or credential level of the program: bachelor's degree, master's degree, professional degree, etc. So in order for us to calculate metrics about a GE or non-GE program, what we need to know is which students completed the program during the cohort period, and we determined that using our own enrollment information from NSLDS. We need to know how much federal debt the student took on, so we know that as well from NSLDS, so schools don't have to report those two items. But we also need to know the amount of private loans borrowed by the student for the program, and any other institutional debt. And we also need to know the amount of institutional scholarships that the completers received throughout their programs. And we don't have that information, so all of that has to be reported by the institution. And then finally, we need to know the earnings of completers, which will be provided by, right now, the Internal Revenue Service from individuals' tax returns. Let's go on to the next slide. So there are a couple of different kinds of reporting. And I'm going to go through at a high level of detail what those are. So there is going to be a period of where schools are required to do initial reporting for all award years prior to 23-24, and that reporting is due July 31st, 2024. After that, the schools will be required to provide information from the most recently completed award year by October 1st, 2024. And then ever after, you'll be reporting for the most recently completed award year on October 1st every year. However, there is a specific option that we're providing for schools, recognizing that this is a lot of reporting that you're expected to do. So for the first 6 years that the department calculates step to earnings rates and earnings premium measures, schools can either choose to report under what we call the standard method or the transitional method. Under the standard method, the schools will report all information for all the students in the cohorts I just mentioned. So it could be 2nd through 7th or 8th for qualifying graduate programs. Or the school can report only for the most 2 recently completed award years. And in that case, we would use debt from the students who graduated in the 2 most recently completed award years to look at the student's debt as part of the debt to earnings rate. And we would use earnings from the original cohort back in the past. So it's actually 2 different sets of data, but it still turns into the metrics that we ultimately publish for the program if the school chooses the transitional option. Let's go on to the next slide. So there's different kinds of reporting that's due when schools do this. There's program level reporting that's reported only for the most recently completed award year by October 1st. There's student level reporting that for currently enrolled students, and that's for students who are currently enrolled. They have an enrollment status in NSLDS that has them currently enrolled as the end of the last most recently completed award year. So you report that information by October 1st each year. And then you report data for students who completed or withdrew at the student level. You'll do that reporting for prior years by July 31st, 2024. And then ever after, you'll do reporting for the most recently completed award year for completers and withdrawn students by October 1st. We can go on to the next slide. So there are some exemptions from reporting, from some fairly limited exemptions. Institutions that are located in a U.S. territory or any of the freely associated states are exempt from all reporting requirements, as well as institutions that offered no group of programs in the same 4-digit zip code range that had 30 or more completers over the last 4 years. Those programs those institutions are not required to report. Those tend to be very, very small institutions, but they are exempt in those cases. And there are some exemptions on the student side and the program side. As we mentioned before, prison education programs and comprehensive transition programs aren't always exempt. So students in those programs are excluded from all parts of this regulation. Students who qualify for total and permanent disability discharges, students who enrolled in another institution, or students who have died, all of those individuals are excluded by the department. We also exclude certain types of loan debt. We do not look at Parent Plus loans. We don't look at Perkins loans. We don't look at Teach Grants converted to direct loans. And in very limited cases where students received FEL loans that might be included in the reporting, we exclude those as well. Let's go on to the next slide. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time going through the exact items that need to be reported, but I believe you will be able to access this presentation and go through these in detail if you choose. I also want to note at the top of the slide that the exact items here are still subject to public comment, which closes on April 22nd. So if you have comments about these items, you can submit them and the department will consider them and consider changes. But you can see that on the left, we've got the data element, on the right, the description. These are the program level items, and I just want to call your attention to a few things in this list that I think are relevant to schools and that you may not be accustomed to collecting. Things like to reporting, I should say. Things like programmatic accreditation, whether the program is accredited by a programmatic accrediting agency, whether the program is designed to meet licensure requirements. The states in the school's metropolitan statistical area where the program does not prepare students for licensure, and then information about the students who take licensure exams and who pass licensure exams. Obviously, all of those questions for licensure purposes only pertain to programs that are designed to help students meet those kinds of requirements. And that'll be part of the things that we ask schools. But if they do, you may be required to provide that information. You can see at the bottom where you're also going to be expected to tell us which of your programs meet the criteria for qualifying graduate programs, as I mentioned before. So go on to the next slide. Here we have the list of reporting items for student level reporting. So this is for currently enrolled students. Again, I want to call your attention just to a few things. You'll be reporting most of these things will be coming from your financial aid systems, but some of them will come from other parts, I'm sure, of your systems. Things like residency, tuition status by state or district, depending on which applies. Things like some of the enrollment timeframes, what their enrollment status was on the first day of enrollment in the program. But the rest of the items generally will come from your financial aid data, including your allowance for books, supplies, and equipment, things like your tuition and fees, total cost of attendance, all of those kinds of things. Let's go on to the next slide. And finally, this is the information that schools will report for students who withdrew and completed prior to the end of the most recently completed award year. And this is a smaller set of data, but this is, in fact, in my view, the most important data that you're reporting, because this is the information that will determine whether the program meets passes or fails the metrics. And so you'll be reporting the total private loan debt that the student took on for the program, the total institutional debt, total tuition and fees, the total allowance for books and supplies throughout the entire program, and the total amount of institutional grants and scholarships that you provided to the student. And just a quick note about those, what we mean when we say institutional grants or scholarships are grants and scholarships that the institution made itself from its own funds, not necessarily outside scholarships that came in, that the student brought in because they worked with, for example, a private organization. These are grants and scholarships that came either from the institution itself or from a foundation that is directly related to the institution that is responsible for fundraising, et cetera, and that is responsible for the school's endowment. Let's go on to the next slide. Just a few items about the actual process for reporting. The department is planning to provide more information about this in the very near future. This spring, the NSLDS system will release reports that will help you identify students who are currently enrolled or withdrawn or completers in the most recent award years to help you determine, depending on which type of reporting you choose, standard or transitional, which students you'll need to report on. Starting in July. Schools can identify the appropriate time frame to accommodate both of those types of reportings. You'll be able to select a range of dates using the reports, and we'll provide some information about the ways that you'll use these reports, how to access them, et cetera, later this month. Go on to the next slide. Then in July, NSLDS will allow schools to report the data itself. So we will release the completers list at the beginning of July. Schools will have 60 days to make corrections to that list. And that list is designed to help us identify the correct students in the cohort. We're going to be using the enrollment information that schools have already provided to do the estimate list. But, there are cases where that enrollment may not be quite accurate, and there may be some occasions where the department gets that wrong. That's why we're giving schools this time to provide us with any corrections that they want to make so that we have the right students to add to the cohort. We'll also provide the submittal file that schools will use to transmit that data that I just mentioned to the department through the NSLDS system. And you could do that either yourselves at the institution, or you could use a third-party servicer if you typically use a third-party servicer to interact with the NSLDS system. More information and technical details on this part of the process will be available in April. Next slide. So this is the last slide here. We do have a number of different resources that you can access if you have questions about the financial value transparency and gainful employment regulations. If you have specific policy questions, please send those to ge24@ed.gov. We are going to create another mailbox for you to submit operational questions, but for the time being. If you have operational questions as well, you can send them to that email address. If you want to submit comments on the data items, you can do that at regulations.gov. The link here on the slide will take you there. We also will have a topics page on FSA's Knowledge Center at fsapartners.ed.gov. You can subscribe for daily or weekly updates at that subscriptions page if you want to get the latest electronic announcements and your colleague letters on this topic. And that will include all guidance, including those policy documents, as well as the operational guides for how you'll actually do the reporting, including templates, etc. I think that's all for me. Thanks, everyone.
So Karen, I think we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. I am very happy to be here with all of you. My name is Karen McCarthy. As mentioned, I work at the National Association of Student Financial Aid Administrators. So if you're not familiar with our organization, we represent financial aid offices at all of your institutions. We have about 3,000 institutional members across the country. So our members historically have been the point office for gainful employment. I know that some of you are new to this whole topic and some of you have been through it in the past. This is not the first go around for gainful employment. It is the first go around for financial value transparency. So in the past, when we were limited to gainful employment, the financial aid office tended to be seen as the focal point within the institution for coordinating the whole process, primarily because this was tied to a Title IV requirement. And generally the perspective on campus is that if it's a Title IV requirement, then that's the financial aid office who's dealing with that. And what we have seen this go around, which I think is a welcome shift, is that now that the breadth and the scope of the gainful employment landscape has expanded to include also the non-gainful employment programs, it is bringing in more offices from around the institution. And so there is no requirement that the financial aid office be the coordinating office for all of this. However, it may make sense that the financial aid office is the party who actually does the final reporting at the end. At its core, these requirements are institutional requirements, not financial aid requirements. And what we have seen with this go around is that the scope and the breadth has naturally pulled in more institutional offices. So we're seeing more of you express interest in the topic, will likely be involved at a greater level than you were in prior iterations of gainful employment. And by and large, I think that is your involvement is very welcome from the part of the financial aid office. As David mentioned, some of the reporting items, the financial aid office will have those at their fingertips, and some of those they absolutely will not. And so they may be reaching out to all of you to collect some of those, work with you on what information you have and whether it does meet the requirements that the Department of Ed eventually does put out. Where we are at this point, as David mentioned, we're waiting for more guidance about how the reporting will work. The reporting is really the kickoff of the implementation, because as he mentioned, that first deadline is in July. You all report your information, and then the Department of Ed kind of takes it from there in terms of the implementation. So we are awaiting a user guide to come out from the Department of Ed that will have a lot more detail so that institutions can begin building their reporting structures from office to office, who's gathering what, where's the data, who's in charge of that data, and so on and so forth. So at this point, what we have been doing at NASFAA is encouraging our members, the financial aid administrators, to be reaching out within the institution to make sure that there is awareness across the institution that we may need your help and your support providing some of your data that you may have that is needed for this upcoming reporting. And so at this point, we're in a little bit of a waiting period. As David mentioned, there is a public comment period that we are in the middle of right now, and we are taking a look at. NASFAA will be submitting some comments in response to that public comment request that is due in April. And I am happy to answer more questions about the financial aid office involvement, and I will turn it over to Suzanne, who's going to pull in the deans.
Thanks so much, Karen, and I expect there will be questions in the Q&A when we get to them. At this point, we want to turn it over to our deans, and Bill will let you kick it off, and Mary and Dana, you can follow in short order. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne. So I'm Bill Graves. I serve as Dean of the Graduate College at Iowa State University. And I am just going to take a few moments to summarize what's been happening here and how we are preparing for the new reporting requirements. So we have been actively preparing for this. We understand that the first report, as we've heard, will be due July 1st, and it will provide student-level data that combine information we've typically reported to the National Student Loan Data System and additional metrics from our own institutional record systems. This first report will provide historical data to the Department of Education that will allow for matching of student enrollment, debt, and income, and will result in median metrics measuring student financial outcomes based on the 6-digit zip code of the program. And I think what Karen mentioned is actually borne out here at Iowa State, where our Office of Student Financial Aid has traditionally overseen this, but the Graduate College, my office, and others on campus have become more engaged at this time because of the changes. The institution here at Iowa State has formed a team of staff members to manage the new requirements. The core of the team consists of our Director of Institutional Research, along with the Manager of Data Analytics from our Associate Vice President for Enrollment Management, her office, and also the Director of Academic Quality within our Office of the Senior Vice President and Provost. That committee has been meeting. The committee also brings in expertise from our financial aid office, and I understand their next meeting is going to be including a representative from our State Board of Regents who will have a broader perspective about all 3 of the state universities in Iowa. The committee has been developing a timeline of activities so that we can be sure that we will be on time with the July 1st reporting deadline. So our plan is to move our data from our financial aid systems and really from our new student information system. Here at Iowa State, we have just launched, gone live with a new student information system, Workday, and we will be using data from the SIS and treating those data with a statistical software package like Stata or perhaps Python. And then I was informed just yesterday that we expect the reporting tool that we will use to be Power BI. We also have been looking at graduate programs and the degree of specialization and different options that exist within a number of our graduate programs. As we've been building our new student information system, we have developed different programs by zip code for each of these areas of specialization and each option area within a graduate program. So we fully expect to be able to report at a great degree of specificity the data based on not just the program like Master of Science in whatever discipline, but Master of Science in that discipline with an option or with a specialization in a particular area. So I think I will stop here and let the other deans comment on what's happening at their institutions, and then look forward to any questions.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Suzanne. Hi, everyone. I'm Mary Stromberger. I'm the Dean of the Graduate School at Ohio State University. And I have been in conversations with our Office of Financial Aid, who has been right now in this early phase leading the efforts and planning for implementing the FVP and GE rules. First of all, I would just say that at Ohio State, there's support for these rules. I think we see that these rules are in alignment with our land grant mission of access and affordability for programs. So there's buy-in, I would say. I think that right now there's just a lot of concern, and as we wait for guidance and clear definitions, for example. And I think what David showed just earlier is incredibly helpful. And so I look forward to having that guidance delivered to our offices in the coming month, so that we can really start planning out the workflow process to gather these specific data variables. So again, our Office of Financial Aid has been working very closely with our Institutional Research and Planning Office, as well as our Registrar's Office, to develop the workflow process to collect and gather the data and then report the data. And they're just now in the phase of then reaching out to other units, including the graduate school and the Office of Undergraduate Education, to bring us up to speed on what they're doing. I will share that a few things that I've heard from the team here at Ohio State is really, again, the need for additional guidance and clarifications on the exact data variables that need to be collected and reported, and an understanding of how, really the way they couched it was understanding how all the data that will be collected from all the various institutions across the country will be consistent. And so that we make sure that all institutions are reporting consistent data. There are some questions that we have specifically around how this might impact distance programs, particularly if cost of attendance is included in some of the analyses and metrics for students who don't live in our state and might be living in states where cost of living is much higher than in Columbus. And the other thing that teams are really looking at is thinking about who in the university will ultimately coordinate the institutional responses. So right now, Office of Financial Aid is leading this. But again, as Karen talked about, this may not necessarily live under Office of Financial Aid, and really who are the groups on campus that will own this process and coordinate efforts. What I want to say from the graduate school perspective is, as we've been thinking about this, and some questions that have come to our mind in the graduate school is the question that I'm getting from faculty is, what is the debt that's being measured? Is it the total debt accumulated by a student combining their undergraduate debt with graduate level debt, or is it only debt incurred as a graduate student? And we have some small but programs that I'm really curious about what will happen with those, like our dual degree programs. So we do have several dual degree programs. We also have what we call combined degree programs that are combined undergraduate, graduate programs, or combined professional degree programs with a PhD program. And so there's some concern that I'm hearing from faculty about how these programs might be impacted by these rules coming into play. The other thing that is another question is that we think about is our certificate programs that fall under the GE rule, for example. And really about, as we start moving forward, we're thinking about stackable certificate programs. What might be the implications for stackable certificate programs that ultimately do lead to a master's degree, but at the time the student is enrolled, it's a standalone certificate only program. And then lastly, the other thing that we're thinking about too is what else can we use these data for? So what are there opportunities here in generating these data and having these data? How might we also use these data for other purposes? And I'm thinking about, talking about how we think about strategic deployment of resources, and maybe that's institutional financial aid or strategies overall to increase affordability, including looking at time to degree completion. So I think that taking a longer point of view is thinking about what are some opportunities that might come out of this. So I'm going to turn this over now to our next dean, Dana.
Thank you so much, Mary. And thank you to CGS for giving us the space to have the conversation. A few of the points that I would have made have already been addressed by Bill rather, and Mary, particularly around the teams that will work together at Howard to make sure that we have on-time reporting. And then also the challenge of our management system. We are also shifting. We have Workday already for our HR for staff, but we're shifting to Workday student. So this reporting will come at the same time that we're also making a transition to a new data system. The good news about it is that we can build it in so that the reporting in subsequent years will be a little bit easier. It may be a little bit tougher for this particular first year as we work out the kinks here. But the point around debt and dual degrees and certificate programs that Mary just raised are a couple of the things that I had. So I'm going to go right now to really combine some things that we have been thinking about along with the concerns that we had related to them. So in terms of our certificate programs that are non-degree certificate programs, obviously our certificate programs are non-degree. What I mean here is those that are not associated with a degree program. We're going to have to reimagine those, we think, in part because our existing certificate programs are really designed as supplements to our existing degree programs. So the certificates are available to students who are in sociology, for instance, and our university and college faculty preparation is really the assumption that those students who are in sociology can take this program and use it to support their goals for academia already. So you can see they aren't distinct. We have just a very limited number, so it won't be that much of an issue. But those that we continue to develop, we'll have to be mindful of how those programs have earning potential related to earning the certificate specifically. The regulation seems to be interested in earning potential and degree quality, but the earning potential, of course, fluctuates. So a point of concern is the slow pace with which academic programs are developed and the time and the investments that it would take to be able to build that, and creating those that are based on earning potential for a shorter period of time or for what we imagine or what we're projecting out is a great need. It's somewhat tenuous. So that's a concern as we're thinking about developing new certificate programs and then costing out our certificate programs, because as I mentioned, most of ours or all of ours, I can say quite candidly, that are in the graduate school assume that the students are paying the tuition. So our certificates are only $500 for the semesters that you are enrolled. Otherwise, you pay, in addition to what that tuition is, an additional $500. So we're also going to have to rethink the tuition and fee structure related to the certificate programs. In terms of the things that we're doing that I didn't hear mentioned very explicitly, but in passing in some ways, we intend to add a category on loan debt and earnings to our degree program evaluation instrument every other year. And some programs it's 2 years, some it's 3, depending on accreditation. We do an academic renewal process or prioritization to review the quality of our programs. And so what we're thinking about there is how we can add a category that really says the quality and viability of a program is also relative to loan debt and future earnings. That too gets a little sticky for us because so many of our programs are mission-based. And so I'm really especially grateful that Suzanne has given us the opportunity to have the conversation as an HBCU, because your sector really will impact not just your ability to report, but then the implications of the reporting. The ability to report has more to do, just to be clear, with whether or not there is the undergraduate loan debt that's associated with it. And that's the point that I think Mary was mentioning, because obviously we have a population of students, some of whom have gone to other HBCUs, but certainly most of whom are from underrepresented groups, and some of whom have, well, our Pell eligible rate is significantly higher than most schools. So with that Pell eligibility, that also means loans. And for graduate programs, that'll have implications, because if the undergraduate loan debt is also considered, then we have some points of concern, quite obviously. But we do think adding that category around debt and earnings to our overall review of the programs will be useful for us, but also will help with the regulation and with transparency. A big one for us is considering career services enhancements that are intentional about students who are matriculating in graduate programs, and then those students who are preparing to graduate. As is the case, I think, for most kind of standard career services programs, the focus is overwhelmingly on undergraduate. That's no different here at Howard. So that also means hiring implications, which we just want folks to be aware of. We'll have to have a whole unit built out that focuses on this, particularly since we're also helping students to think about how to earn additional resources, not by changing their discipline rather, but by being aware of all of the opportunities that are available to them. Then in terms of our team, obviously institutional research, along with financial aid, along with our compliance officer, and then our Office of Academic Innovation and our executive director around programming and or academic programs and curriculum will all have to work together to make sure that we are presenting a picture that is above and beyond the picture that is being called for, in part because if we're looking at a single cohort, we want to make sure that the data is reflected in such a way that it is encouraging students to think about their options instead of discouraging them, especially again in those mission-driven disciplines, which is something that we have to be very clear about. And one of the ways that we'll do that in terms of transparency is, in addition to tracking the earnings, we also want to be able to track, it's a little bit harder, but we want to be able to track job satisfaction, so that you may earn a lower than, I'll use sociology again, a sociologist or an English PhD or master's student may earn a little bit less than one in chemistry, but we also want to match that with job satisfaction. That was probably unfair because a chemist and a sociology person aren't going to be debating about which discipline they're going to do. The sociologist is going to win every time. So the other thing that we want to think about, obviously very explicitly, are what considerations are there being given around the impact that race has on earning and earning potential, since our population is largely informed by earners who tend to face earning discrimination. I'll pause there, just looking at time, and then also thinking about some of the wonderful ways that my colleagues have already begun to address some of the things that I would have made remarks on.
Colleagues, I thank you so much. You have given us another hour's worth of things to talk and discuss. I'm thinking, since we're running a little late, let's start by asking some of the more detailed questions of our Department of Education colleagues, because as a community, I think we can continue to talk about these really vexing problems about how you account for postdoctoral appointments, dual degrees, distant students. I mean, there's a fundamental problem for most of us in computing who a dropout is, and when do we know that the students are dropouts. Data definitions that work for undergraduates may not work for graduates. So let's commit to further discussion, but focus on what I think are three maybe relatively short questions from the audience. And David and Antoinette, I think maybe you would be willing to take them. One asks the pros and cons of using the transition versus the standard method of reporting. Another asks the question, how in the world do you find out if students have taken private loans that don't pass through the federal financial aid system? And let's just start with those two.
Sure. I think I can take those two, Antoinette, if that's okay. So the first question was about whether there are specific advantages and disadvantages to using the transitional reporting method versus the standard method. I think the primary advantage of the transitional method is the reduction in workload. The school only has to report for the two most recently completed award years. So especially in this first year, that could mean the difference between reporting for 4 or 5 years, full years of your completers and withdrawn students versus only the 22-23 award year. You're all going to have to report, and the most recently completed award year, the 23-24 award year. So not only is that data fresher, probably more accessible in some of your systems, but obviously there's a lot less of it, so there's a lot less reporting to do. Now, the downside to that and the upside to using standard reporting is that the data that's being used is from the original periods and it reflects the actual outcomes for those original students. So if you have a program where tuition has increased substantially since the cohort period to the most recently two completed award years, you might have students that have much higher debt in the most recently two completed award years, which would represent poorer debt outcomes for that program compared with students in the older cohort. So if that's true for you, you may still want to choose to use the standard reporting cohort if many of your programs fall into that category. So the second question was about how schools would know about private loans that students are taking out on their own, and that certainly happens all the time. You could also ask about loans that parents are taking out for they're taking out mortgages on their homes, et cetera. The school doesn't know about any of those things and they're not expected to. So the only loans that you have to report are loans that went through the financial aid system or that you should reasonably have been aware of. And there's a very specific, what we mean by that are cases where you certified the loan for the student. That's a very specific process that's outlined in the regulations for private loans under the Truth in Lending Act requirements. So the financial aid office is only really going to be aware of those. Anything else the student took out for attendance is not something you have to worry about reporting. You don't have that information.
Thanks, David. Maybe I can follow up a little bit with maybe it's my own, I didn't catch it. I know there's questions and interest in, for example, combined PhD, MD programs and these dual degree programs. And it looks like the ones that are subject to a longer career outcome have already been fixed. When's the next time and how can people start raising these questions? It sounded like it was going to be 3 years, but maybe you can clarify.
Yeah, that's right. So the department is going to analyze this again in 3 years and look to data that we have for programs across the spectrum, especially looking at cases where graduates are earning very low amounts, because we're going to have that information following the first few years of gainful employment and financial value transparency. And we'll publish a list for public comment for the community to respond to before we finalize that list. But that's the idea, is that in 3 years, we're going to do that. And then every 3 years after that, we'll go through the same sort of process so that we can identify these kinds of programs where the data shows us that it's really not appropriate to use a cohort that's only a few years back from when we're assessing earnings.
Okay, I think we have a couple more minutes. And again, if we can turn to our Department of Education colleagues. I mean, this is one of these, so the devil is in the detail kind of question, and this notion of how will we get enough consistency in the way universities are defining variables and pulling data that they actually can answer them. So for example, what is there a formula for computing cost of attendance, and does it take into account the online students? I mean, how do we, is there or will there be a standard definition of cost of attendance or even withdrawal from a program? I mean, is it the formal withdrawal as signified by a submission of a letter? I mean, just if you could talk a little bit about enrollment status, cohort, when do cohorts begin and end? Some of these
Yep.
devil
No,
in the detail questions.
all wonderful questions, and I'll do my best. So with the withdrawal question, it's a very good one, and it was a big challenge in the 2014 regulations. We had a lot of questions about it. Schools felt a little uncomfortable determining the exact time frame, especially for students if they weren't subject to RTD4 in that last period, because there are cases where students didn't get aid in that last period. A lot of that is not going to apply here because the department is relying on its own data that you've already reported to us from NSLDS to identify the dates of withdrawals and completions. So there are already established processes for you guys to report when a student has withdrawn and completed. And if you're curious about those rules, you can go to the NSLDS enrollment reporting guide that outlines the current requirements, or you can go back in the past to see what they were back in 2018 and before that. But that's how we're identifying the cohorts. We'll be looking at what the individual status was at the end of the award year that's applicable. So if they completed and then had no other status at the end of that award year for the same program, they're a completer for that program. If they started a new program, then that's going to be irrelevant to the prior program. Same with withdrawals. If that's their status for that particular program, which means zip code and credential level, then that's their status for financial value transparency. There's a thornier question, I think that I heard about debt and cases where you've got dual degree programs that are at the undergraduate and graduate level. The department has spent a lot of time trying to work through that one, and it's not specifically spelled out in the regulations, so I'm not surprised that folks are asking it. It's a very good question. So what the department is planning to do, and this will be explained in more detail in guidance coming up, is separate the debt such that only the graduate debt applies to the graduate portion of the program. And we'll actually count the student twice, but bear with me here. So for debt purposes, we'll count them as a graduate student, but only the debt that the school provided to that student as graduate debt, and they're classified differently in our system, will count for the graduate portion of the program, and only the undergraduate debt will count for the undergraduate portion of the program. So by and large, if you have other standalone programs, those dual degree program students are likely going to drive down your debt because they have more efficiency in the way that they complete their programs. It's usually over a shorter period. And there's usually some efficiency in terms of credits that count both toward the undergraduate and the graduate portion of the program. So that's how the department plans to separate those so that we only look at one or the other.
Okay, we're going to do one last question, and it comes from one of our attendees who asks, what about programs that have a lot of international students? What will happen in terms of value and salary return? And how do we balance that very real aspect of graduate education and sort of thinking about the value proposition?
Yeah, it's a great question too. So by and large, international students are sort of excluded from these programs. So there likely will be a lot of cases where if your program has a lot of international students and you only have 1 or 2 students who receive Title IV aid, you will not have a rate calculated for that program because you'll have less than 30 individuals for whom we have earnings. So you won't have any student, and if they didn't get Title IV at all, they're also excluded from the calculation. So that tends to reflect both one or the other will tend to reflect most of your international students. They tend not to be eligible for Title IV aid, and they often earn funds in their home countries. Sometimes they don't, but even though in those cases, it's likely they won't be counted. So what that means is that if you have larger programs that are, let's say, half and half, we're only going to be looking at the students who receive Title IV aid, and that's the limit of our statutory authority to do this work. So you may have international students that are doing well, that are part of your programs, but they will be excluded from the calculation. And unfortunately, there's no way around that. But we do believe that in the vast majority of cases where the program is primarily international students, there won't be rates calculated.
Well, I want to thank David and Antoinette for joining us. Many thanks, Karen, for coming to this conversation and helping us better understand where financial aid offices are. Dana, Mary, and Bill, we may very well call on you again to help facilitate additional thinking and conversation, both about the challenges, but also about the potential uses these data provide for us to improve both our cost efficiency and our career preparation of graduate students. So thanks to all. Sarah, I don't know if you are going to say this or not, but I will do so. We really hope, graduate deans and colleagues, that you will join us at the summer workshop at New Deans Institute this July in Boston. There will be more conversation of this particular question, as well as others related to financing and cost of graduate education and career outcomes. So with that, thank you. And we will turn your afternoon back to you. Take care, everyone.